Hello, Daphne here with what I hope you will find to be a very interesting story about my maternal grandparents. In the late 1800s, my grandparents were the first Americans ever to set up a business in Vladivostok, Siberia. My grandmother became very famous for her photographs of that part of Russia at that time in history. She also was a prolific letter writer and sent back home very vivid stories about the life in that part of Russia in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The people of Vladivostok have honored Granny greatly by erecting a statue in her memory in downtown Vladivostok. What an emotional experience it will be for me, along with my husband, to stand next to this statue for the first time, to walk in the footsteps of my grandparents around the city. I know this will be one of the most extraordinary and special trips of my lifetime. Granny to me was an extraordinary woman, a stalwart in every sense of the word. I loved her dearly. At the young age of 14, I lost her. Nonetheless, I remember many special moments we shared, and especially about her love of Vladivostok. Now I have the pleasure of sharing with you the story about my grandparents' life, way far away from America and a very long time ago. Thanks to the gifted writer, reporter, and National Awards winner from the Portland, Maine Press Herald, Jillian P. Graham, we are in possession of an amazing article she wrote about my Granny Prey. Most of the article will be shared in this video. It was 1894 when Eleanor Prey found herself more than 6,000 miles from home, living on the shores of the far eastern Russia state of Siberia and writing to her family in Maine about a life she never could have imagined living. The thousands of letters over 36 years were not only sent to her family and friends back in Berwick, but her family and friends all over the world. Her letters painted a picture of a farm girl from a small town, Maine, navigating her new lifestyle from Tsar Alexander III to the early years of Stalin's rule. Granny provided an astonishing record of life in Vladivostok at that time in history. And Granny's letters and photographs are now housed in the Library of Congress, connecting that small town in Maine on the New Hampshire-Maine border to the bustling Russian port, where a bronze statue of Granny, clutching a letter to her chest, stands near her home of 3 decades. The existence of Eleanor Prey, let alone her legacy of words and image, is not widely known in her hometown of Berwick, but in Vladivostok she is celebrated for providing an opportunity for the city to rediscover a piece of history that has been lost to war and the Russian Revolution. The contents of Granny's prolific letter writing provide the citizens of Vladivostok a look back in time, and they are fascinated by what she described. They have found their heritage and are very, very grateful. The Areniev, and I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, spelled Arseniev, State Museum in Vladivostok, a decade ago opened an exhibit about my grandmother that remains popular to visitors this day. And curators now hope to open an even larger exhibit in the home where my grandparents once lived. Roxana Eleanor Lord was born in 1868 and grew up in Berwick in a house she called Elmwold, a tiny cottage just uphill from the river separating the small farming town from neighboring Somersworth, New Hampshire. As a young woman, she worked 7 years in a mill in Somersworth, crossing the river each day on a footbridge near her house. Eleanor Lord, nicknamed Aunt Roxy by family members and friends, was 26 when she married my grandfather, Frederick Ted Prey, and moved with him to Russia to work in the American store owned by his sister and brother-in-law, Charles and Sarah Smith. In the spring of 1894, the Smiths and Preys went to East Siberia together, traveling first by train across the United States to San Francisco, then by schooner to Japan and on to Vladivostok. In Russia, they were members of the well-to-do middle class. Vladivostok is a port city on the Golden Horn Bay, not far from Russia's borders with North Korea and China. The city, with a current population just over 600,000, is the home port of the Russian Pacific Fleet and the country's largest port on the Pacific Ocean. When Granny moved there, Vladivostok was still a remote outpost some 7,000 miles east of Moscow and 16 hours ahead of New York City. It is still astonishing for me to imagine a woman in the 1890s immigrating to a city on the far reaches of the Pacific. It was a true frontier, and out west a wild eastern frontier, said a member of the old Berwick Historical Society. Eleanor Prey discovered that she was in a privileged social situation in Vladivostok that she didn't enjoy in Maine. But Granny Prey was not a particular fan of being in the upper crust of society. From the day of her journey to the destination so far from home, my grandmother wrote long letters to her family and friends in New England. Some letters were 40 to 50 pages long, describing in detail the meals she ate, the visitors she had, the new friends who had moved from all over the world to live in Vladivostok, and in time, the political turmoil that drastically altered the city she grew to love. A farm girl from Maine, Roxy Prey lived through great events and had the wherewithal to record them. Granny learned to speak several languages while in Vladivostok. She read voluminously and led a vibrant, cosmopolitan life very different from her provincial origins in Maine. She met generals, admirals, royalty, and political leaders, and she danced to her heart's content aboard the warships in the harbor. She also saw the vast destruction of people and property during the political turmoil of the time, and lost everything that she held dear in Vladivostok, except her memories and her pride. I remember Granny telling me the story about standing up to a Russian Bolshevik officer. She had a command presence like no other. They didn't dare touch her, no matter what remarks she made to them. My grandmother's early letters described navigating life in a new country. She wrote about the beauty of the hills rising around Vladivostok, the way a ship waltzed across the harbor, nearly frozen Golden Horn Bay she loved, and the simple joys of collecting mushrooms in an open field. Granny wrote in letters, "Beyond Paris, Vladivostok is probably the most fascinating city on the earth at the moment. We are so lucky to witness so many interesting things happening around us here and now in this magnificent city." But in 1904, the Russo-Japanese War was in full swing, and Granny's letters home began to include descriptions of how life in her beloved Vladivostok was changing. In April of that year, my dear grandmother received an inquiry from the State Department in Washington, D.C., about her safety. I was feeling particularly blue when it came, and it just warmed my heart. I felt that Uncle Sam was watching over his very own citizens, she wrote to her family. At the start of World War I, Granny stood on a train platform to wave goodbye to her German friends headed into exile. During the political upheaval that began in 1940 and continued into the 1920s, many foreigners living in Vladivostok left the city to return home. Those who stayed, including Granny and her sister and brother-in-law, were uprooted from the lifestyle they had enjoyed. Frederick Prey, my grandfather, went back to work for the U.S. consulate in Vladivostok and in 1918 closed the American store. Soon after, Granny Prey began work as a volunteer and treasurer with the Vladivostok chapter of the American Red Cross. After the death of her husband in 1923, Granny was left devastated. With insufficient funds, she took on tenants into her home, cooked frugal meals, and went to work as a bookkeeper to support herself. When the firm where she worked closed in 1930, my grandmother had no choice but to leave Vladivostok for Shanghai, China, where her daughter, my mother, attended school, and her sister-in-law, Sarah, worked as a dorm mother. In one of her last letters from Vladivostok, Granny wrote about her farewell dinner, describing the bowls of snapdragons and white dahlias on the table, the cold salmon served for dinner, and the lump in her throat at the idea of leaving it all behind. Granny wrote aboard the SS Glennifer as she left Vladivostok, and I quote, "Here I am sailing on and on, every turn of the screw taking me farther from the home I loved for 36 years. Makes me almost want to weep reading that. She was on her way to Shanghai. My grandmother stayed in Shanghai for years. She became a house mother at the Shanghai American School, the alma mater of my mother. Subsequently, she moved in with my mother and father, who had a beautiful home located in the international settlement in Shanghai. After the attack on Pearl Harbor during World War II, Granny was interned with the rest of our family in a Japanese prison camp. We were fortunate to be liberated in late 1943 and returned to the United States in an exchange of American and Japanese prisoners of war on the Swedish ship, the Gripsholm. How I enjoyed hearing stories about my Granny's total lack of adhering to rules she thought were unreasonable. One example, Granny's orders were to take no personal documents, but she smuggled out a cache of letters in her corset. Being a portly woman, she also stashed my mother's silver around her waist. She stuffed other items into suitcases of her 3-year-old granddaughters, me and my twin sister. Out of respect for the elderly, the Japanese didn't dare touch her. Also, she did get away with a lot of mischief when she went up against Japanese guards in concentration camp. She was full of character. She personified the meaning of an intrepid woman. Though she did not return to New England to live in her later years, Granny never lost sight of her roots or her great love for Maine. In recent years, the Russian Museum curators spent more than a week in Berwick to learn more about Granny's roots and her life in Maine in the late 1800s. They listened to the Baptist hymns Granny enjoyed, visited places she described in her letters, and studied Victorian traditions and American culture. They visited the house near the Salmon Falls River where Prey spent her early years, and met with the locals who are now discovering a piece of their own town's history through visits with Russians and 3,200 letters Granny sent home. The State Museum in Russia's exhibit about my grandmother has continued to be popular with visitors, who also use books of Granny's letters and photos to explore the city all those many, many years ago. Over 100 years ago. The house where Granny lived in Vladivostok is now an apartment building, but the museum wants to transform it into an exhibit that showcases the life of this port city in the early 1900s. It's human nature to find out what life was like. It was human nature to want to find out what life was like 100 years ago, said a person from the State Museum. Eleanor Prey was a foreigner living far away in Russia. So many people really want to know how life was in the city. So much curiosity about an American who could be uprooted and thrive so far away from home. How sad I was the day my mother called to announce that my very, very beloved grandmother had died. She woke up in the morning, one February morning in 1954, in my mother's home in Georgetown, Washington, D.C., went to the kitchen, fixed a cup of coffee, sat down to enjoy it, and moments later, she slumped over and died. She was 85 years old. Her body was returned to New Hampshire, where she was buried alongside her husband and the Smiths in Somersworth. There you have it, the story of my courageous, brave, and intrepid grandmother, and as her proud granddaughter, my planned trip to Vladivostok in a year's time to visit her beloved city all those years ago will be an extraordinary experience. Cannot imagine what emotions will be running through my heart and soul when I put my arms around that amazingly beautiful statue of my grandmother, clutching a letter she was about to send back home. My incredible, invincible grandmother lived through historic times and provided a special heritage, revered and cherished by me, one of her most devoted descendants. This concludes the story about my one and only and very, very special Granny Prey.